How did a group of steppe nomads become the founders of one of the largest empires the ancient world had ever seen? That question sounds almost backwards. When most people think of Iran, they imagine an old civilization rooted in stone, cities, royal courts, and memory layered so deeply into the land that it feels inseparable from the plateau itself. Yet the deeper one looks, the stranger the story becomes. The people who would one day call themselves Arya, and whose name would echo in the word Iran, do not first appear in the historical record as builders of palaces in the south. They emerge from a much harsher world of open grassland, wheeled mobility, horsepower, shifting horizons, and violent opportunity. Their story is not the story of a people appearing fully formed inside a nation that already bore their name. It is the story of migration, collision, adaptation, and reinvention across centuries. To understand Iran as a civilization, we have to begin before Iran was truly Iran, in a world of steppe frontiers where language traveled faster than walls, and identity was forged long before empire gave it stone. The first paradox is this: Iran stands among the oldest continuous civilizational landscapes on Earth, yet the earliest ancestors of the Iranian-speaking peoples did not begin their story on the Iranian Plateau itself. For thousands of years before Iranian languages appeared, the plateau was already a living human world. Valleys supported early agriculture. Highland pastures carried seasonal herds. Small villages and regional cultures rose and faded across the Zagros Mountains and the dry interior basins. Long before the names of Medes or Persians were ever spoken, the land was already part of the ancient Near Eastern mosaic. In the southwest, the civilization of Elam had already formed one of the great early states of the region. Its cities stood along the frontier between Mesopotamia and the Iranian highlands. Susa became a major political and cultural center whose written history reaches back into the 3rd millennium BCE. Even Anshan, the city later linked to the early Persian kings in the region of Fars, first emerged as an Elamite center centuries before Persian power appeared. Seen in this light, the beginning of Iranian civilization does not mark the beginning of human life in Iran. It marks the arrival of something new, layered onto something far older. When Iranian languages eventually spread across the plateau, they did not enter an empty land. They settled upon landscapes already shaped by farming communities, ancient trade routes, and long-standing cultural traditions. Over time, those worlds intertwined. Languages shifted, identities blended. Older societies adapted rather than disappeared. That realization changes the question entirely. The story is no longer about where the land of Iran began. The deeper question is when a new people, speaking early Indo-Iranian languages and carrying with them a social world shaped on the Eurasian steppe, entered this ancient landscape and slowly transformed it into something new. That realization leads to another common assumption. Many people imagine that Persians had always lived exactly where Persia would later appear on the map, as if the land, the language, and the people all emerged from the same soil at the same moment in history. It is an understandable idea. Empires have a way of making their origins appear stable and permanent. When later generations look back at powerful states, it becomes easy to imagine that the civilization ruling those lands had always belonged there. This perception was reinforced in the ancient world. When Greek historians first encountered the vast Achaemenid Empire in the 6th and 5th centuries BCE, they described it simply as the Persian Empire. They used that name because the ruling dynasty came from Parsa, a region in the southwest of the Iranian Plateau that later became known as Fars. From the Greek perspective, the empire appeared Persian because Persian kings sat at its center. The imperial court spoke Old Persian. The royal lineage traced its roots to that southern homeland. Over time, this perspective shaped the way the outside world understood the entire civilization. But the deeper historical and linguistic record tells a far more dynamic story. The word Persian originally referred to only one group among many Iranian peoples. The broader term Iranian describes a much larger family of languages and communities that spread across an enormous geographic space. This world included the Medes of western Iran, the Persians of Fars, the Scythians of the Eurasian steppe, the Sarmatians and Alans of the northern plains, and many other societies whose histories stretched from the Black Sea to Central Asia. Even the ancient self-designation, Arya, found in old Persian inscriptions, and the sacred texts of the Avesta, seems to have referred to a wider cultural and linguistic community. It described people who shared related traditions, languages, and social structures rather than a single tribe or kingdom. Seen from this wider perspective, Persia was never the origin of the Iranian world. It was one branch that eventually rose to political dominance within a much older and much broader Iranian cultural landscape. So, where did this wider Iranian world actually come from? The strongest evidence points far to the north and northeast. Beyond the Iranian Plateau lies the immense grassland belt of Eurasia, a landscape of open horizons stretching from Eastern Europe across Central Asia. This steppe and forest steppe zone beyond the Caspian and Aral seas formed one of the great human frontiers of the ancient world. The first clues came from linguistics. Scholars studying language patterns noticed that Iranian languages belong to the Indo-Iranian branch of the Indo-European family. That family includes languages as distant as English, Greek, Latin, and Russian. Yet the closest relatives of Iranian languages appear not in Europe but in ancient India. Sanskrit and Avestan preserve striking similarities in grammar, vocabulary, and poetic tradition. These connections suggested a shared origin long before written history. In recent decades, archaeology and ancient DNA have strengthened this picture dramatically. Genetic studies across South and Central Asia reveal a significant influx of steppe-related ancestry during the Bronze Age. These genetic signals connect early Indo-Iranian populations to societies living across the Eurasian steppe thousands of years ago. But this was not a single migration sweeping south in one moment. Human history rarely moves in simple waves. Instead, the evidence points to a long process of movement across frontier landscapes. Mobile pastoral communities expanded across the steppe. They carried horses, wheeled transport, ritual traditions, and languages that spread through networks of migration, alliance, and conflict. Over generations, these societies moved gradually toward the south. When they eventually reached the Iranian Plateau, they did not replace the older populations living there. They merged with them, language spread, cultural traditions blended. New social structures formed from the meeting of steppe mobility and settled agricultural worlds. Seen from this perspective, the origin of the Iranian peoples was never a single birthplace. It was something far more complex. It was a migration system stretching across the heart of Eurasia. Within that northern world, two archaeological horizons stand out with unusual clarity. They are known today as the Sintashta and Andronovo cultures. They were not empires in the sense that Persia would later become an empire. They left no marble palaces and no written chronicles of kings. Yet their influence may have reshaped the balance of power across Eurasia. The Sintashta horizon emerged along the southern edge of the Ural Mountains around the early 2nd millennium BCE. Archaeologists have uncovered fortified settlements surrounded by timber walls and defensive ditches. Inside these communities lived metalworkers, herders, and warriors whose lives revolved around bronze production, horse management, and organized conflict. What makes Sintashta particularly striking is the appearance of some of the earliest clear evidence for spoke-wheeled chariots. Burials from this culture contain paired horses, chariot fittings, and the distinctive wheel design that would later transform warfare across the ancient world. From this frontier zone, the broader Andronovo horizon spread across a vast arc of central Eurasia. Communities linked to this cultural sphere occupied grasslands stretching from the Urals deep into Kazakhstan and beyond. Many scholars associate these societies with early Indo-Iranian speaking populations, although the exact identification remains debated. What is less debated is the technological and social transformation taking place. In this world, distance no longer meant isolation. Horse traction and lightweight vehicles allowed elite groups to move faster than ever before. Mobility became a form of power. Warfare, prestige, and ritual display were increasingly tied to the control of horses and chariots moving across the open steppe. The chariot was not simply a machine. It was a social weapon. It allowed small warrior elites to project force across enormous landscapes. It created new forms of ceremony and hierarchy. It magnified status in a world where speed and skill could determine survival. When later Indo-Iranian traditions celebrate heroic warriors, cattle raids, divine favor in battle, and the restless movement of warrior bands, they are preserving distant echoes of this steppe world. Long before Iranian civilization built capitals, roads, and royal courts, its cultural ancestors were being shaped in a very different environment. A vast laboratory of movement stretching across the Eurasian steppe. At some point during the late Bronze Age, the Indo-Iranian world began to divide into two distinct historical paths. This separation did not occur in a single moment, and no surviving chronicle records the day it happened. Yet through language, archaeology, and genetic research, we can trace the outlines of that turning point with surprising clarity. One branch moved gradually toward the south and southeast. These communities eventually entered the northern regions of the Indian subcontinent and became the Indo-Aryan tradition preserved in the ancient Vedic texts. The hymns of the Rig Veda still carry echoes of their steppe heritage. They describe chariots, warrior aristocracies, cattle wealth, and ritual worlds that closely resemble those reconstructed for the Indo-Iranian societies of the Eurasian steppe. The other branch followed a different trajectory. These groups remained more closely tied to the Iranian-speaking world that would later spread across Central Asia and the Iranian Plateau. Over time, their languages evolved into the early Iranian family that would eventually include Median, Old Persian, Sogdian, and many other branches. This was not a sharp frontier dividing two isolated peoples. Instead, the evidence suggests a landscape of overlapping migrations and long contact zones. Communities moved across river valleys, grasslands, and mountain corridors. They exchanged ideas, technologies, and beliefs, even as their languages slowly drifted apart. One clue to their shared past lies in an ancient word that appears in both traditions. The term Arya occurs in early Indo-Aryan texts and also in Iranian sources such as the Avesta and Old Persian inscriptions. In its original context, it seems to have referred to a cultural and linguistic community rather than a rigid ethnic category. Much later in history, the word would be misunderstood and misused in ways completely detached from its ancient meaning. But in the Bronze Age, it pointed to something far simpler and far more human: a shared Indo-Iranian heritage. This division matters because it reveals that the Iranian peoples were never an isolated phenomenon confined to one land. They were one branch of a much larger Bronze Age transformation that reshaped societies across Eurasia. From related steppe-derived communities, two great cultural streams emerged. One flowed south into India, the other spread across Central Asia and the Iranian Plateau. Each would grow into a civilization with its own languages, traditions, and historical destiny. When Iranian-speaking groups began to move toward the Iranian Plateau, they did not step into an empty wilderness waiting to be named. The land they approached was already layered with ancient communities, older trade routes, and established political worlds. Their arrival was not a sudden invasion that swept across the landscape in a single generation. It was a slow and uneven process that likely unfolded across centuries. Archaeologists and historians attempting to reconstruct these movements often place the earliest Western Iranian arrivals somewhere in the northeastern and northwestern regions of the plateau during the late 2nd and early 1st millennium BCE. Over time, these communities gradually expanded into the uplands and valleys that lay between the great civilizations of Mesopotamia and Central Asia. By the 9th century BCE, the picture begins to appear more clearly in written records. Assyrian royal inscriptions, mention groups living beyond the Zagros Mountains, whose names can be associated with peoples later known as the Medes and the Persians. To the Assyrians, these societies appeared as small tribal polities scattered across difficult terrain. Even so, caution is necessary when interpreting this evidence. The archaeological trail is more complex than the tidy narratives once promoted by older nationalist histories. Material culture does not always map neatly onto language or ethnicity. A particular pottery style does not necessarily mean the arrival of a specific people. Even major reference works such as Encyclopedia Iranica acknowledge that the precise moment when the Medes first entered the plateau remains uncertain. Yet despite these uncertainties, the broader pattern remains visible. Iranian-speaking tribes gradually moved south and west from steppe-connected worlds. Many likely passed through the corridors of Central Asia before filtering into the Iranian Plateau. By the early 1st millennium BCE, they had become a noticeable presence along the political margins of the region. What they carried with them was more than a language. They brought pastoral strategies suited to harsh landscapes. They carried traditions of warrior aristocracies shaped by steppe mobility. Their societies were organized through clans and tribal alliances capable of adapting quickly to changing conditions. These qualities allowed them to survive in the rugged uplands between powerful states such as Assyria, Elam, and Babylon. In those frontier zones, a new chapter of Iranian history quietly began. When Iranian-speaking groups pushed deeper into the plateau, they encountered civilizations whose roots ran far deeper into the land than their own. Foremost among them was Elam. Centered in the fertile lowlands and highland corridors of the southwest, Elam had already existed for many centuries before the first Iranian tribes became visible in the historical record. Its cities stood along the crossroads between Mesopotamia and the Iranian Plateau. Susa served as one of the great political and cultural centers of the ancient Near East. Anshan, later associated with the early Persian royal line, had long been part of the Elamite world. Elam possessed features that defined an established civilization. It had written traditions used for administration and diplomacy. It had organized political institutions capable of ruling cities and territories. It maintained trade and diplomatic relations stretching across Mesopotamia and beyond. It also possessed a complex religious landscape rooted in temples, rituals, and local deities tied to the land. To the west, the situation was even more formidable. Beyond the Zagros Mountains lay the great Mesopotamian powers. Assyria and Babylon commanded some of the most sophisticated states on earth. Their kings ruled through bureaucracies, recorded their triumphs on stone, built monumental cities, and fielded organized armies capable of long campaigns. This is what makes the Iranian story so remarkable. The newcomers were not sweeping into a forgotten wilderness. They were approaching some of the oldest urban civilizations humanity had ever created. Yet it would be a mistake to imagine them as simple barbarians, standing helpless before superior societies. Steppe-derived communities carried strengths of their own. Their metalworking traditions were highly developed. Their warriors were accustomed to mobility and open warfare. Their political leadership was flexible and adaptable, shaped by clan alliances rather than rigid bureaucracies. Just as important was their ability to adopt useful ideas without losing their identity. They could learn, they could absorb, they could adapt. The future Medes and Persians therefore grew in the shadow of older civilizations. They faced states that could tax populations, record history, construct monumental architecture, and conduct organized sieges. To survive in that world required transformation. To eventually dominate it required something even greater. A synthesis between the mobile traditions of the steppe and the institutional knowledge of the ancient Near East. That long process of interaction and adaptation marks the true birth of Iran as a civilization. It did not emerge from a single tribe suddenly conquering a land and replacing everyone who lived there before. Instead, it formed through centuries of cultural blending across one of the most complex crossroads of the ancient world. Recent research in ancient DNA has strengthened this picture. Genetic evidence suggests that populations connected to Indo-Iranian expansions did not move south as isolated groups. Along the way, they mixed extensively with settled societies of Central Asia. Among the most important of these were communities associated with the Bactria Margiana archaeological complex, a network of fortified settlements and oasis cultures that flourished across parts of modern Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, and northern Afghanistan during the Bronze Age. These societies possessed agriculture, long-distance trade networks, and sophisticated craft traditions. When steppe-derived groups interacted with them, the result was not simple conquest. It was exchange and integration. By the time Iranian-speaking communities reached the plateau, their identity was already shaped by multiple layers of contact. Once inside Iran, this process continued. Iranian identity expanded through interaction rather than replacement. Languages spread gradually across landscapes already inhabited by diverse populations. Local traditions did not vanish. Many survived in altered forms beneath new cultural frameworks. Religious ideas evolved as older beliefs blended with incoming ritual systems. Political traditions hardened as Iranian tribes confronted powerful neighbors and learned how states actually functioned. Even the rise of the Persians reflects this deeper layering of history. The Persian homeland in Fars was once firmly within the Elamite cultural world. The early Achaemenid royal line traced connections to the city of Anshan, a reminder that Persian power emerged on ground shaped by earlier civilizations. For this reason, Iranian civilization cannot be reduced to a story of bloodline purity, tribal conquest, or a single migration event. It was a layered formation built across generations. Steppe-derived language and social identity fused with older agricultural societies, urban traditions, and highland cultures already present across the plateau. From that fusion, something new emerged. A civilizational core flexible enough to survive repeated upheaval. Empires would rise and fall across the Iranian world for thousands of years. Yet the deeper cultural framework that formed in those early centuries proved remarkably resilient. What endured was not the survival of a single tribe. It was the survival of a civilization capable of constantly reinventing itself. By the time the historical record begins to sharpen, this emerging Iranian cultural core had already started producing larger political formations. The first of these to appear clearly in written sources were the Medes. Assyrian records from the early 1st millennium BCE describe groups living beyond the Zagros Mountains, whose names and territories correspond closely with what later Greek historians would call the Medes. These communities appear not as a single unified kingdom at first, but as a constellation of tribal polities scattered across the rugged uplands of western Iran. Whether there was ever a fully centralized Median empire remains a subject of debate among modern scholars. What is less debated is the historical environment in which these Western Iranian groups evolved. For generations, they existed in direct contact with some of the most powerful states of the ancient Near East. To the west stood Assyria, with its disciplined armies and bureaucratic administration. To the north rose the kingdom of Urartu in the Armenian highlands. To the south lay Babylonia, with its deep urban traditions and long political memory. Living beside these powers forced the Iranian tribes to learn quickly. They watched how states organized armies, collected tribute, administered territory, and recorded authority. The frontier between the Zagros Mountains and Mesopotamia became a political classroom where tribal leadership slowly absorbed the techniques of statecraft. From this world of shifting alliances and upland confederacies, another group would eventually rise to prominence: the Persians. Originating in the southwest of the plateau, in the region later known as Fars, the Persians began as one Iranian community among many. Yet, under the leadership of Cyrus II, they accomplished something earlier confederations had not managed to achieve. They united the Iranian world. Around 550 BCE, Cyrus overthrew the Median ruler Astyages and brought both Persian and Median territories under his authority. From this base, he expanded outward with extraordinary speed, absorbing Lydia in Anatolia, conquering Babylon, and establishing a multinational empire whose scale had no precedent in the ancient world. This moment marks a fundamental turning point. Migration becomes monarchy. Frontier aristocracy becomes imperial administration. A people once defined by mobility across upland frontiers suddenly becomes the political center of the Near East. Cyrus matters not only because he conquered territories, he matters because he transformed diversity into structure. The Iranian world he inherited was a mosaic of tribes, languages, traditions, and local identities shaped by centuries of migration and interaction. Instead of erasing those differences, Cyrus built a state capable of organizing them. Within the empire, each region could maintain its customs, its languages, and its religious traditions while still functioning within a broader political framework. In that sense, the empire of Cyrus was not simply a Persian victory. It was the political crystallization of the long historical process that had shaped the Iranian world itself. So the final answer to our opening question is not that nomads suddenly became civilized. Civilization does not appear like a switch flipping on the moment horsemen discover cities of stone. History is rarely that simple. What actually happened was far more gradual and far more human. One of the greatest empires of the ancient world was built by people who had already spent centuries learning how to move between different worlds. Their distant ancestors came from the wide grasslands of the Eurasian steppe. There they learned mobility, pastoral survival, and the martial traditions of warrior societies shaped by horses and open horizons. Yet as they moved southward through Central Asia, those traditions did not remain unchanged. They encountered oasis cultures, agricultural settlements, and long-established trade networks. They adopted techniques. They absorbed ideas. Their identity continued to evolve as they entered new landscapes. When Iranian-speaking groups finally reached the plateau, they did not create Iran from nothing. They stepped into a region already shaped by older civilizations such as Elam and by the long shadow of Mesopotamia. Instead of disappearing into those deeper traditions, they did something more remarkable. They adapted. They reorganized. They fused steppe mobility with the institutional knowledge of older societies. By the age of Cyrus, this long process had transformed the Iranian world. Iran was no longer merely a destination for migrating tribes. It had become a civilizational synthesis, strong enough and confident enough to shape the political center of the ancient Near East. This is what makes the Iranian story so important in the broader history of civilization. It reminds us that civilizations are rarely born from purity or isolation. More often they emerge from motion, from pressure, from the meeting of different cultures across contested landscapes. Iran was not formed in a single birthplace or in a single moment. It was assembled slowly across centuries of migration, encounter, conflict, and survival. A mobile identity became a historical civilization, and perhaps that is why the memory of Iran endured so stubbornly across time. Empires would rise and fall across the plateau for thousands of years. Yet, the deeper cultural framework that formed in those early centuries continued to shape the region long after individual kingdoms disappeared. Iran was never just a kingdom drawn on a map. It was a long act of becoming. If this story stayed with you, share the country you are watching from and tell us what part of Iran's early journey surprised you the most. Here at Prehistoric Shadows, the goal is not simply to retell the past. It is to preserve the memory of how human civilizations were truly made.